Loss doesn't knock. It seeps, quiet, subtle, unassuming. There's no grand announcement, no thunderous exit, only the absence of something that once filled a space you never admitted existed. You think you're in control, you set the terms, draw the lines, manage expectations with surgical precision. The relationship operates under your conditions, no vulnerability, no dependence, no risk. From the outside, everything seems functional. You're calm, detached, measured, but underneath that carefully constructed exterior lies something else, something raw, undiscovered, and undeniably human. Avoidance feels safe. It provides distance. Distance creates illusion. Illusion offers comfort. You build walls so tall that even you forget what they were meant to protect. Emotions are packaged neatly, sealed off from inspection. Intimacy becomes negotiation. Expressions of affection become transactions. You don't say what you feel because feeling requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement opens doors. Doors invite entry. Entry means exposure. Exposure means danger. But when the right person walks in, not forcefully but gently, with patience instead of pressure, curiosity instead of control, something shifts. You don't recognize it at first. Their presence doesn't feel threatening. It feels warm, familiar, almost like home. Yet you still brace yourself. Not for them, but for what they awaken. At first it's easy to explain away your distance. You're busy, preoccupied, distracted. You say things like, "This is just how I am." You mistake self-protection for self-awareness. You assume they'll understand. And for a while they do. They give grace, show compassion, extend kindness in ways you've never seen. But over time, that grace wears thin, not from resentment, but from fatigue. Holding space for someone who refuses to stand in it is exhausting. And slowly, silently, something sacred begins to unravel. When they finally leave, there's no storm, just stillness. They don't scream. They don't accuse. They simply walk away, choosing themselves because they realized you weren't ready to choose them. And that's when something unexpected happens. The silence becomes deafening. Not the kind that gives peace, but the kind that reminds you what once filled it. Every moment you didn't lean in echoes louder. Every compliment you dismissed. Every vulnerability you met with silence. Every chance to connect that you sidestepped. It all comes rushing back. Not as regret, but as revelation. You begin to feel something you've worked your entire life to avoid. Grief, not grief for a breakup, but grief for the version of you that stayed hidden when someone finally wanted to see. You remember the laughter you half-heartedly returned, the glances you avoided, the invitations to emotional presence you declined. They didn't ask you to be someone else. They just wanted you to show up. And that, more than anything, terrifies you. Avoidants often think they're protecting others by staying distant, that they're doing kindness by not becoming too dependent, too involved. But the truth is, it's not about protection, it's about fear. Fear that if someone sees the real you, they won't stay. So instead, you keep them just far enough away that if they leave, it won't hurt. But now they're gone, and it still hurts. Because it wasn't about proximity, it was about meaning. They meant something. You just couldn't say it. Now, with the distance you once craved, you're left with clarity you never expected. You see how your silence became a message, how your inaction became an answer. You recognize how intimacy isn't always about physical closeness, but about being emotionally available when it counts. And you weren't. Not because you didn't care, but because caring out loud is a skill you never learned. You thought emotions were liabilities, that needing someone was weakness. But now, without them, you realize that true strength lies in openness, not armor. Their absence becomes your teacher. It doesn't berate, it reflects. You start noticing things. The way your voice softened when you spoke to them. The rare moments you reached for their hand without realizing. The comfort in their presence, even during silence. They were a mirror, not of your flaws, but of your possibility. They saw not just who you were, but who you could become. And you ran from that, not because it was false, but because it was true. Because it challenged everything you believed about yourself. People think avoidants don't feel, that they're cold, indifferent. But that's not the truth. They feel deeply, so deeply that it overwhelms them. So they shut down, numb, disconnect. And yet when someone truly matters, the emotions refuse to stay buried. They rise, uninvited, inconvenient, undeniable. And when that someone is gone, the cost of suppression finally comes due. You can't outrun feeling forever. Sooner or later, it catches you. You begin to remember, not just moments, but their weight. The way they listened when you didn't speak. The way they stayed when you pushed. The way they believed when you doubted. These weren't gestures, they were anchors. And now, untethered, you're drifting through a sea of realizations. You didn't lose them in a single moment. You lost them in a series of missed chances, each one small, almost invisible, but together, enough to create distance that even love couldn't cross. This is the moment most don't talk about. The aftermath. The awakening. Not everyone gets there. Some double down, blame, distract, replace. But if you're still enough, honest enough, brave enough, you begin to see what your avoidance was hiding. Not just from them, but from yourself. The ache isn't about losing someone else. It's about losing the version of you that could have existed, had you just let go of fear long enough to be known. Loss, in its brutal clarity, uncovers what you've buried. It strips away pretense. It demands honesty. And in that honesty, there's opportunity. Not for repair, but for recognition. You finally understand that the right person didn't want perfection. They wanted participation. They didn't need answers. They needed effort. They didn't ask for you to have it all figured out. They asked for you to try, to care out loud, to be real, even when it felt risky. And now that they're gone, you see it. What you avoided wasn't them, it was the vulnerability they invited, the emotional responsibility they inspired, the unfamiliar safety they offered. They were the proof that connection doesn't have to mean chaos. That love doesn't always end in loss. That maybe, just maybe, closeness can heal, instead of harm. And now with them gone, that truth remains, and it asks you one thing: what will you do with it? Because now you know, you've felt what avoidance masks, you've tasted what distance costs, you've witnessed what leaving looks like when someone who mattered, decided they couldn't wait for you to show up anymore. And no matter how much you try to forget, to justify, to minimize, the memory lingers, not as punishment, but as a marker, a reminder of what was possible, and what can still be if you ever choose to stop hiding. Yet, once awareness hits, denying reality grows harder. Emptiness doesn't stay vague, it sharpens with reflection. Thought patterns unravel slowly, revealing truths no longer suppressed. Escape isn't sustainable. That lingering ache buried under distractions now demands acknowledgement. Defense systems buckle beneath accumulated weight. What once felt like composure begins resembling paralysis. That numbness was never strength. It was a silent alarm. Pretending doesn't equal resilience. It merely postpones confrontation. And when that inner reckoning begins, timing offers no mercy. You might laugh outwardly, hold small talk, maintain social appearances, but within that void expands. Each suppressed memory returns louder. Scenes replay unexpectedly. Their laugh resurfaces mid-silence. The way they looked when you dismissed affection. Every ignored attempt, brushed off care, unspoken apology, all amplified. Emotional armor gives an illusion of control. You convince yourself detachment safeguards peace. It becomes easy to confuse isolation for independence, coldness for calm, disinterest for self-preservation, until detachment ceases being protection and turns into punishment. Not imposed externally, but self-inflicted. Not punishment like pain inflicted, but a hollow, aching neutrality where joy forgets how to arrive. Those who create distance eventually find themselves stranded. Genuine connection doesn't wait indefinitely. No matter how generous, patient, forgiving someone tries to be, there's a threshold. When crossed, departure becomes inevitable. And when that occurs, sudden clarity pierces. A paradox appears: you tried avoiding hurt, and that exact maneuver delivered deeper wounds. Silence once welcomed, now haunts. Empty notifications aren't just digital gaps. They sting. They remind you of a presence that used to arrive without effort. Familiar routines no longer soothe. Songs, scents, places, all transformed into reminders of what once breathed life into your daily existence. You still function, but nothing feels quite alive. That's the price. Not loud heartbreak. Quiet grief. Not collapse. Erosion. For those who avoid emotional openness, understanding this doesn't come easily. Intellectually, you knew consequences were possible. But understanding isn't feeling. Logic doesn't replace experience. You believed staying reserved meant you'd never endure devastation. But the truth? Emotional detachment delayed your heartache. It didn't eliminate it. And when it finally lands, it hits without preparation, without warning, without cushioning. You walk through familiar environments, only now everything looks altered. People speak, but words lose meaning. You wonder if they noticed your internal unraveling. Most don't. Avoidants often become skilled at performing fine. But underneath, there's a deep, painful absence they can't articulate. Because doing so requires vulnerability, the very thing they spent years resisting. So the question arises, not just about what was lost, but why you responded that way. Where did that fear originate? What early moment taught you that emotional exposure equals danger? Somewhere along the way, someone made you feel unsafe expressing truth. Somewhere pain taught you to close off. Maybe not directly, maybe not with cruelty, but it was enough. And since then you've built your life protecting yourself from a wound that's long since healed, but whose scar convinced you to never risk being touched again. That past memory dictated your present behavior. But the one who left wasn't them. They weren't the one who hurt you. They tried to love the part you buried, and now they're gone, and that part of you is screaming to be seen. Because emotions don't disappear. They wait, they gather strength. Then they emerge with vengeance, demanding attention, forcing presence, denying denial. All of this reveals a deeper reality. Emotional numbing isn't a neutral choice. It has consequences. Not always immediately, sometimes gradually, but eventually it costs something. Relationships, joy, fulfillment, peace. It denies not just pain, but everything beautiful that travels alongside pain. Because love, connection, meaning, none exist without risk. You can't selectively mute feeling. There's an irony here. You wanted to stay unscathed. You thought detachment meant security. But now in this aftermath, you realize it created fragility instead. Not obvious fragility, hidden fragility. The kind that looks fine on the surface, but crumbles under reflection. You start recognizing how you missed opportunities to grow, to expand, to heal. Not just alone, but through connection. The right person didn't demand emotional perfection. They simply needed authenticity. They didn't expect every feeling to be shared, but they needed evidence that feelings existed at all. They needed to see effort, attempts, movement, anything beyond silence. And you withheld that, not maliciously, but habitually. And now their absence echoes louder than their presence ever did. That echo isn't just longing, it's accountability, not punishment, reflection. It reveals how many moments were filtered through caution instead of honesty. How many words were chosen out of fear rather than truth. How many boundaries were walls in disguise. You begin seeing the ways detachment wasn't discipline. It was doubt. Doubt that if you showed up as you truly are, you'd still be chosen. And now you're left not just missing them, but questioning yourself. Regret becomes familiar. Not dramatic, but persistent. A quiet what if that follows your every step, not because you want to rewrite the past, but because you finally understand it. You finally realize they weren't asking for grand gestures, just real ones. And while they offered understanding, you returned distance. Now that distance remains, only without the option to close it. You look around and notice others moving forward, building lives, creating intimacy, embracing unpredictability. You wonder how they do it, how they trust, expose, risk. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispers they're not fearless, they're brave. And bravery doesn't mean absence of fear. It means showing up anyway. Exactly what you couldn't do, not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't believe you could. Now sitting in that aftermath, you realize healing won't arrive through suppression. Numbing won't protect you. Detachment won't prevent loss. It creates it. You tried preserving yourself through isolation, but in the process you denied connection the chance to reshape you. You kept love at arm's length, hoping it would remain. It didn't. And that absence isn't just lonely. It's instructive. If there's one thing this experience makes undeniably clear, it's this: emotions unexpressed don't vanish. They store. They wait. Then one day they emerge, not to punish, but to remind you of what mattered. You weren't immune. You were unprepared. You weren't heartless. You were scared. And now you're no longer protected, only exposed, fully, finally. Eventually, every delay brings illumination, not through comfort, but through the unraveling of internal scaffolding built for survival, not living. The one who departed didn't inflict damage. They revealed it. They didn't break you. They uncovered breaks already present, hidden behind practiced composure. What felt like abandonment was in truth a reflection of inner stagnation. Their existence wasn't chaos. Their presence wasn't intrusion. Their voice didn't demand surrender. They simply stayed long enough to hold a mirror where there used to be a blindfold. They spoke softly, offering steadiness where there had only been turbulence. They gave warmth instead of pressure, patience instead of pride. And rather than celebrate that sanctuary, you mistook it for discomfort. Not because it harmed you, but because it confronted you. In their light, shadows became noticeable. In their steadiness, your patterns stood out. Every time they leaned in, your instinct pulled away, not out of apathy, but from years spent rehearsing independence. Not the healthy kind, but the lonely kind. The kind where love feels threatening because it disrupts the narrative that you don't need anyone. You told yourself you were whole without intimacy, that you functioned better without reliance. But they weren't asking you to fall apart. They were asking you to be seen. And being seen means letting go of the performance. It means choosing truth over image, choosing discomfort over detachment, choosing courage over repetition. Growth isn't always exhilarating. Often it's awkward, unfamiliar, unstable. It exposes blind spots, highlights habits formed in self-defense. But only through confrontation does real transformation begin. And this person, the one who tried, was never asking for perfection. They simply wanted evolution. They needed movement. They were willing to walk with you through uncharted territory, but not if you refused to take even one step forward. Instead, you shut the door, slowly. Not with cruelty, but silence. Not with finality, but hesitation. And in that stillness, they saw the writing you refused to read. They recognized a choice: stay and shrink, or leave and breathe. And though you may not have heard it then, the quiet departure carried a message louder than any speech. Love cannot flourish where resistance reigns. They didn't need grand declarations. They needed depth, authenticity, willingness. But rather than reach inward, you defaulted to distance. Not because connection wasn't valued, but because it wasn't understood. Because every time they got close, something inside whispered that exposure equals weakness. That tenderness equals vulnerability. That opening up risks being hurt again. But now that they've walked away, you start realizing something else. Vulnerability wasn't the threat. Avoidance was. Intimacy wasn't suffocating. Your walls were. Their love wasn't conditional. Your receptivity was. They weren't the ones running. You were. Not physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. So when you find yourself alone, not lonely, but alone, you begin asking better questions. Not why did they leave, but why couldn't I meet them halfway? Not what was wrong with them, but what have I been too afraid to explore within myself? Not how do I get them back, but what would it take to become someone capable of staying open when love arrives? The answers aren't simple. They don't arrive in one sitting. They appear in fragments, moments of awareness during otherwise mundane experiences. A quiet evening that feels unusually hollow, a memory that surfaces while folding laundry, a sudden realization while driving. Healing doesn't send invitations. It shows up when you're ready, or when staying the same becomes too painful. Their absence, instead of just being something to mourn, begins to serve as something sacred. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because it teaches. And what it teaches is this: you don't need to run. You don't need to hide. You don't need to pretend your past excuses. You're present. You are allowed to evolve. In fact, you are required to, if connection is something you truly crave. But growth demands confrontation. Not with them, with yourself. With that inner voice you've ignored. With that inner child who learned early on that affection equals risk. That trust means eventual loss. That dependence equals disappointment. That nothing lasts, so holding back equals safety. The truth is, this isn't about one relationship. It's about what that relationship represented. A fork in your life's path. A chance to stop repeating stories passed down from wounds you never gave yourself permission to examine. They gave you something rare, not just affection but an invitation. An opening. A blueprint. You were being shown another way to live. And that scared you. So now in their absence, you finally look where you used to turn away. You begin rewriting internal narratives. Reframing closeness. Redefining trust. Not overnight. Not effortlessly. But deliberately. Consistently. With curiosity, not shame. With hope, not judgment. Because if someone was willing to love you in your half-light, imagine what's possible in your fullness. It becomes clear that healing isn't about finding another person to replace the last. It's about becoming someone who can receive that kind of love, without shrinking, without questioning, without sabotaging. You don't need someone to rescue you. You need someone who meets you where you are while challenging you to rise beyond it. And to accept that, you must first believe you're worthy of that challenge. They saw your potential. They didn't fall for your mask. They fell for the glimpses of you that peeked out, when you weren't trying so hard to stay composed. They loved your contradictions, your quiet strength, your hesitant tenderness. You thought they wanted the version of you that had it all figured out. They didn't. They wanted the real you, even when you didn't. And now you finally understand the right person doesn't trigger fear. They reveal where it lives. They don't shame your insecurities. They shine light on them so they stop controlling your behavior. They don't force change. They inspire it. You didn't lose someone ordinary. You lost someone extraordinary, because you weren't ready to meet them with the same openness they offered. Not because you didn't care, but because you hadn't yet confronted the parts of yourself frozen in self-preservation. That realization isn't punishment. It's purpose. Because now you know, and knowing if truly embraced changes everything. Truth begins not in movement, but recognition. The pause after loss doesn't only echo absence, it summons confrontation, not against outside forces, but inwardly, where old narratives linger in shadows. Every deflection, every retreat, every hollow reply was never random. Behind every instance stood something unacknowledged, something avoided, Running doesn't always involve footsteps. Often, it's choices. Conversations avoided, emotions muted, patterns repeated. There's a moment quiet yet definitive, when you realize the one who walked away didn't leave you, they departed the fiction you built. The fortress constructed from silence, ambiguity, performance. Healing isn't built on pretending that fortress was ever home. Recovery requires remembering, but not just events. Remembering the self before defense mechanisms took over. The self who wanted tenderness, asked for closeness, believed in belonging. Somewhere along time's path, that version became unsafe to inhabit. So you adapted. You adjusted. You armored. Not out of deception, but necessity. Until the adaptation became identity. Until you forgot the difference. Facing pain means returning there. Walking back into that house built by your younger self. The one still waiting to be heard, not fixed. The one still questioning why comfort had to be earned, why affection arrived conditionally, why vulnerability felt dangerous. You won't find healing by bypassing those echoes. You find it when you enter those spaces fully. Everything ignored waits. Time doesn't erase trauma, it buries it under behaviors dressed as logic. When someone loves you, truly sees through your stillness, those behaviors become transparent. You fear they'll abandon you if they witness what's beneath. But they never needed perfection. They wanted presence. They wanted you raw, unsure, flawed, honest. That frightened you more than rejection ever could. Avoidance operates like anesthesia, numbing discomfort while simultaneously muting joy. When you ran from discomfort, you unknowingly ran from fulfillment. But now, left without that mirror, the one who stayed long enough to show your reflection, you stand at a threshold. Behind lies repetition. Ahead, uncertainty. The unfamiliar terrain of growth. Healing isn't soothing. It's excavating. Excavating stories passed down through glances, dismissals, long silences, unanswered questions. It's peeling back each layer formed in response to fear. Not with anger, with compassion, because everything you hid to survive. But survival isn't living. It keeps you breathing, not connecting. It sustains function, not freedom. You don't fix wounds by hiding them. You face them, not once, but consistently. In conversation, in solitude, through expression, through tears withheld too long. You look your history in the eye, not to dwell, but to disarm its hold. Because every part you silence deserves volume now. Every forgotten feeling deserves voice. That departure wasn't punishment. It was catalyst, an invitation toward wholeness disguised as heartache. You assumed escape would keep you safe, yet you discovered escape stole your clarity. Now grief becomes gateway, sorrow becomes compass. You follow it inward, not toward despair, but toward liberation. No one teaches us how to unravel emotional armor. There's no script for reopening, after years spent building barriers.
But when you do, slowly,
painfully, something unexpected happens. Peace returns. Not as noise dies down, but as authenticity steps forward. When you stop rehearsing and begin revealing. Not dramatizing. Just existing unfiltered, you begin noticing beauty again. Not in grand events, but in details once overlooked. Morning light warming the windowsill. Laughter shared without caution. Eye contact held a beat longer. You relearn presence, not performing. Just being. With yourself, then maybe later, with someone new. Not because you've earned it, but because you've allowed it. Facing what hurt you doesn't reopen wounds. It disinfects them. It clears out the rot that built inside unspoken emotions, untended memories, misunderstood patterns. You stop blaming others for distance you maintained. You stop expecting closeness while pushing away touch. You understand finally that healing starts with accountability, not shame, but ownership. Every day brings micro opportunities to choose honesty over comfort, transparency over pretense, to say what you feel before it calcifies. You may stumble. Regression isn't failure. Progress isn't linear, but this time your effort doesn't hinge on approval. You move, speak, open, not to be chosen, but because you finally choose yourself. There's no deadline for wholeness, no timeline for restoration. What matters isn't speed, but sincerity. You listen inward. When guilt rises, you don't suppress it. You question it. When fear whispers, you don't obey. You investigate. Not everything internal deserves
authority.
Not every inherited belief deserves space. Healing doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for presence. You stop disappearing when things get intimate. You stop defaulting to withdrawal when discomfort arises. You remain. You breathe through the tension. You respond instead of react. And slowly you realize the discomfort doesn't define you. It stretches you, expands you. Some may never understand your transformation. That's okay. This path isn't performance. It's reclamation of your truth. Your voice, your depth, the very parts once muted for the sake of acceptance. You no longer trade authenticity for peace. You create both, simultaneously, through boundaries, through integrity, through healing. That person you lost, they sparked this. Their exit broke the illusion that everything was fine. And now in the ruins of that comfort, real growth begins. Because you stopped running. You turned inward. You faced the thing that hurt most. Yourself, not your worth but your wounds. Not to judge, but to reclaim.